The interpretation of the Zend Avesta. The peace did not last long, and a year after the death of Bernalf, a new controversy broke out, which still continues, the battle of the methods. It is the dispute between those who, to interpret the Avesta, rely chiefly or exclusively on tradition, and those who rely only on comparison with the Vedas. And what about those who are more fundamentalist and look straight to the texts themselves for what they say? The cause of the rupture was the rapid progress made in the knowledge of the Vedic language and literature. The deeper one penetrated into the oldest form of Indian words and thoughts, the more striking appeared its close affinity with Avesta words and thoughts. Many a mysterious line in the Avesta received an unlooked-for light from the poems of the Indian rishis and the long-forgotten past and the origin of many considered to be gods and heroes, whom the Parsi worships and extols without knowing who they were and whence they came, were suddenly revealed by the Vedas, emboldened by its bright discoveries, which comparative method took pity on its slower and less brilliant rival, which was then making its first attempts to unravel the Pahlavi traditional books. Is it worthwhile, said the Vedic scholars, to try to slowly and painfully extract the secret of the old book from that uncouth literature? Nay, is there any hope that its secret is there? Translating the Avesta in accordance with the Pahlavi is not translating the Avesta, but only translating the Pahlavi version, which, wherever it has been deciphered, is found to wander strangely from the true meaning of the original text. Wandered into polytheism at the very least, and the professional priesthood, and taking some of that away from the people. Tradition, as a rule, is wont to enforce the ideas of its own ages into the books of past ages. From the time when the Avesta was written to the time when it was translated, many ideas had undergone great changes. Such ideas tradition must needs either misunderstand or not understand at all, and tradition is always either new sense or nonsense. The key to the Avesta is not the Pahlavi, but the Veda. The Avesta and the Veda are two echoes of one and the same voice, and the reflex of one and the same thought. The Vedas, therefore, are both the best lexicon and the best commentary to the Avesta. The traditional school replied that translating Zend by means of Sanskrit and the Avesta by means of the Vedas, because the Zend and the Avesta are closely related to Sanskrit, and the Vedas is forgetting that the relationship is not identity, and that which interests the Zen scholar is not to know how far Zen agrees with Sanskrit, but what it is in itself, and what he seeks for the Avesta is the Avesta, not the Veda. Both the Vedic language and the Vedas are quite unable to teach us what became in Persia of those elements which are common to the two systems, a thing which tradition alone can teach us. By the comparative method, the Zend Merega, which means a bird, would assume the meaning of gazelle to accord with the Sanskrit Mrga. Ratu, a part of the day, would be extended to a season out of regard for the Ritu. Menu, a spirit, Dahu, a province, would be degraded to anger and to a set of thieves, and the demons, the Daevas, would ascend from their dwelling in hell up to heaven to meet their philological brothers, the Indian Devas. The traditional method, as it starts from matters of fact, moves always in the field of reality. The comparative method starts from a hypothesis, moves into a vacuum, and builds up a fanciful religion and a fanciful language. Now, see, that sort of thing, it's not that it's the same entities per se, it's that different languages use different words for things, and even to create enmity between one group of people and others are to foster it. You find such uses. Such being the methods of the two schools, it often happens that a passage translated by two scholars, one of each school, took so different an aspect that a layman would have been quite unable to suspect that it was one and the same passage he had read twice, yet the divergence between the two methods is more apparent than real, and proceeds from an imperfect notion of the field in which each of them ought to work, that ought not to oppose, but assist one another, as they are not intended to instruct us about the same kind of facts, about two kinds of facts quite different and independent. No language, no religion, that has lived long and changed much, can be understood at any moment of its development unless we know what it became afterwards and what it was before. The language and religion of the Avesta accord but for a moment in the long life of the Iranian language and thought, so that we are unable to understand them unless we know what they became and whence they came. When they became, we learn directly from tradition, since the tradition arose from the very ideas which the Avesta expresses. Whence they came, we learn indirectly from the Vedas, because the Vedas come from the same source as the Avesta. Therefore it cannot happen that the tradition and the Veda will really contradict one another if we take care to ask from each only what it knows, from the one the present, and the past from the other. Each method is equally right and equally efficacious at its proper time and its right place. Certainly some of the material and psychological culture may differ, but the religions aren't supposed to change with time. It's not, modernizing is not the same thing. So you have corruptions of the traditions narrowing down into sectarianism. Perhaps one side, they both are authentically here, but you have the two sides splitting on an issue when they didn't have to split. Or perhaps neither side is supported. They've just, The first place belongs to tradition as it comes straight from the Avesta. The second, inquiry, to be successful, requires infinite prudence and care. The Avesta is not the past of the Veda is not the past of the Avesta, as the Avesta is the past of tradition. The Avesta and Veda are not derived from one another, but from one and the same original, diversely altered in each, and therefore there are two stages of variation between them, whereas from the Avesta to tradition there is only one. The Veda, if first interrogated, gives no valuable evidence as to the words and gods common to the two systems. Well, there's a lot more if you look at structure itself. That's in common. May not have retained in both the same meaning that they had in the Indo-Iranian period. They may have been preserved in one and lost in the other, or they may have both altered it, but each in a different way. The Veda, generally speaking, could not help in discovering matters of fact in the Avesta, but only in explaining them when discovered by tradition. If we review the discoveries made by the masters of the comparative school, it will be seen that they have, in reality, started, without noticing it, from facts formally established by tradition. In fact, tradition gives the materials, and comparison puts them in order. It is not possible either to know the Avesta without the former, or to understand it without the latter. Well, certainly even, I'm not saying the conservative tradition is always wrong. It certainly preserves information. But, got to look at, okay, where's all this coming from? The traditional school, and especially its indefatigable and well-deserving leader, Spiegel, made us acquainted with the nature of the old Iranian religion by gathering together all its materials. The comparative school try to explain its growth. The traditional school published the text and the traditional translations and produced the first Parsi grammar, the first Pahlavi grammar, and the first translation of Avesta, which had been made since Anquetil. The danger with it is that it shows itself too apt to stop at tradition, instead of going from it to comparison. When it undertakes to expound the history of the religion, it cannot be but misled by tradition. Any living people, although its existing state of mind is but the result of various and changing states through many successive ages, yet at any particular moment of its life keeps the remains of its former stages of thought in order, under the control of the principle that is then predominant. Thus it happens that their ideas are connected together in a way which seldom agrees with their historical sequence. Chronological order is lost to sight and replaced by logical order, and the past is read into the present. Comparison alone can enable us to put things together in their proper order, to trace their birth, their growth, their changes, their former relations, and lead us from the logical order, which is the shadow, to the historical order, which is the substance. While perhaps the traditional order of a text is unveiled by the logical order, and that's not just revealed text, inspired text, or traditions of what an amalgamation of these things could be, like the Bible. Some things might become apparent if you look at the preciseness of what the text actually says. The comparative school developed Indo-Iranian mythology. Roth showed, after Bernalf, how the epical history of Iran was derived from the same source as the myths of Vedic India, and pointed out the primitive identity of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Iran, with Varuna, the supreme god of the Vedic age. In the same direction, Munchban, in his Zoroastrian essays, and in these studies of Mithra and Anahita, displayed singular sagacity. It would be unjust, when speaking of Haug, not to recall the invaluable services which he rendered in the second part of his career as a Pahlavi scholar. He was the first who thought of illustrating the Pahlavi in the books, by the Pahlavi in the inscriptions, and thus determined the reading of the principal elements in the manuscript Pahlavi. But the dangers of the method came to light in the works of Haug, who, giving definite form to the system still fluctuating, converted Mazdaism into a religious revolution against Vedic polytheism, found historical allusions to that schism both in the Avesta and of the Veda, pointed out curses against Zoroaster in the Vedas, and, in short, transformed, as it were, the two books into historical pamphlets. That's interesting. I would like to know more about these quotes, and the context about the authenticity of the Avesta. One party must necessarily have been right and the other wrong, but in the present struggle the issue is not so clear, as both parties are partly right and partly wrong. Both of them, by following their principles, have rendered such services to science as seem to give each a right to cling to its own method more firmly than ever. Yet it is to be hoped that they would see at last that they must be allies and not enemies, and that their common work must be begun by the one and completed by the other.